Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. These closing chapters of the book of 2 Samuel contain a series of isolated vignettes from David's life. They're not in any particular chronological order, but are intended to act as events along David's timeline that summarize his reign. In 2 Samuel 21, verses 15 through 22, the emphasis is on the war that David waged against the Philistines throughout his lifetime. From the day he had slain Goliath, the Philistine champion, to the last moment of his life, David had been forced to do battle with this perennial enemy of Israel. And as we'll see, David and his men would face some formidable foes from within the Philistine camp. These men were supersized and larger than life. But regardless of their stature, these Philistines would be no match for David and his men, because they had God on their side. The Philistines were great, but God was greater. It's impossible to tell from the text at what point these events occurred in David's reign. It's assumed that they took place in the early days of his kingship, but there's really no way of knowing definitively. As part of the, quote, appendix to the book, they're designed to provide the reader with an overview of David's rule. In these closing verses of chapter 21, we're given insight into the ongoing war David waged with the Philistines. Ever since his days as the young shepherd boy in his defeat of Goliath, the Philistine champion, David had been in a constant war with the Philistines. And it seems that Goliath had relatives who held a grudge against David for his victory over their champion. We're introduced to four of them in these verses: Ishbi-benob, Saph, Goliath, and the unnamed man with 26 toes and 26 fingers. Each of these men were larger than life, both literally and figuratively, and posed a real threat to David and the nation of Israel. But they fell at the hands of David's men. But why? It would be tempting to make this all about the four men who accomplished these mighty deeds on behalf of David and the nation of Israel: Abishai, Sibbecai, Elhanan, and Jonathan. Chapter 23 will even introduce us to the mighty men of David, a select group of individuals who displayed almost supernatural military prowess. But rather than put our focus on these men, we should immediately recognize the hand of God. The victories of Israel over the Philistines and their seemingly endless line of champions was due to God, not these men. Yes, they had to fight. They were required to go into battle against superior adversaries and risk life and limb, but their victory was due to God, not themselves. Verse 22 tells us, "These four were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants." But once again, their victories were made possible by God. The author's emphasis on each Philistine's larger-than-normal size and bigger-than-usual weapons is meant to paint a picture of impossible odds. Yet David's men came out victorious. These were not normal foes. One of them even had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. But they fell at the hands of David's men because God was with them. David's reign would be marked by war. His battles against the enemies of Israel would never end. And once again, we must recall the fact that this characteristic of David's reign was due to the failure of Joshua and the people of Israel to obey God and rid the land of all its inhabitants. They had been partially obedient and therefore semi-successful. And as a result, David was left with the task of finishing what Joshua had begun. And his battles would last the entirety of his reign. It would be his son Solomon who would reign over a kingdom marked by peace. But David's tenure as king would be one of constant war and bloodshed. And God would be with him. That's the message found within these verses. And what should really jump out at us is the faithfulness of God, even in the midst of all the unfaithfulness surrounding David and the people of Israel. David's victories were not the result of his own faithfulness, but that of God. God was sparing him in spite of him. Time and time again, we have seen David fail God in sometimes epic fashion. But God remained faithful to his promises to David. It would have been easy for the men of David to make much of their individual successes. They could have, and probably did, brag about their victories over superior enemies. But the message for us is one of dependence upon God. We are only as great as our God. To be victorious, we must understand that our God is glorious.